This is the Read to Lead podcast, episode 153.
Hi, I'm Clay Clark, author of Thrive, How to Take Control of Your Destiny and Move Beyond Surviving Now. You've taken a crucial first step by listening to this. It's the Read to Lead podcast with my friend, Jeff Brown.
Welcome to the Read to Lead podcast with Jeff Brown. Jeff believes that if you desire to achieve true success in business and in life, then consistent and intentional reading is a must. The Read to Lead podcast will not only help you narrow this ever-important reading list, but also bring you key insights and valuable feedback from some of today's most successful and inspiring authors. And now, here's Jeff.
Hello there and welcome. This is the podcast dedicated to your personal and professional growth. As you no doubt realize, I'm a big believer in the impact of reading on one's success in business and in life. And that's why I'm very excited today to present to you the 12 all-time best business and personal development books from my interviews with nearly 150 authors. When you ask that many people to recommend their favorite business and personal development books, you can imagine it can take quite a while to sift through all those recommendations and determine which books are being recommended the most. Well, that's what we're going to look at on today's episode of the Read to Lead podcast. And be sure and stick around to the end of the episode to learn how you can win a copy of all 12 of these books for yourself. This list, by the way, would not have been possible without the help of Jonathan Ytterberg. He's a Read to Lead podcast listener who has helped put together the Excel spreadsheet that lists every guest, every book that's been featured from that guest, and every book they've recommended over the course of the life of this show. Jonathan and I are currently working on getting this published on the Read to Lead site, something that can be a living document on the site so you can go back at any time and check out this resource. Well, in the 3.5 years of hosting Read to Lead, as you know, I've been afforded the pleasure of one-on-one sit-down chats with nearly 150 popular business book authors. And if you are a regular listener to the show, you know that one of my favorite questions to ask each guest is which books over the years have had the biggest impact on you and why? Well, now seems as good a time as any to scour the Read to Lead archives and compile a list of the books receiving more mentions from my guests than all the others. If you're looking for a short list of books you should be reading, or if you want to get an idea of whether or not you've read some of the best books available today, maybe you're looking for that perfect gift for that special someone, today is your day. Either way, with some of the world's most popular and successful authors doing the recommending, you can't go wrong with any of these books, that's for sure. Now, to be clear, I've narrowed this list with Jonathan's help to the 12 most recommended business and personal development books. Occasionally, a non-business book receives a nod from a guest. Both the Bible and The Alchemist come to mind as two that were mentioned often. Those and a few others have been purposely excluded from this list. So without further ado, here are the 12 business and personal development books receiving the most recommendations from some of the world's best-selling business book authors. In at number 12 is one of my personal favorites. It's a book called 48 Days to the Work You Love, Preparing for the New Normal, and it's written by Dan Miller. Now, it's interesting that this book begins our list as its author, Dan, also began our podcast. He was my first ever guest in episode 1. Now, in that episode, we talked about a more recent book that Dan's written with his son Jared called Wisdom Meets Passion. Now, Dan would come back for episode 67, and in that episode, we talked about 48 Days to the Work You Love. It was January 2015, and the book had just been released in a special 10th anniversary edition. It has obviously stood the test of time, as several former guests have recommended this book. Folks like Kamanzi Constable and Derek Olson, among others, have recommended it. Kamanzi says he's read it no less than 5 times, and that with each new reading, I find I'm inspired all over again by Dan's words to keep forging ahead. I personally have purchased this book for a number of family and friends over the years. I even recommended it to a coaching client just the other day. It still shocks me to find people who haven't yet heard of this book. Again, it's number 12 on our list, and it's called 48 Days to the Work You Love, Preparing for the New Normal by Dan Miller. I recommend the 10th anniversary, updated and revised edition that came out in January of 2015. In at number 11 on our list is a book called Decisive: How to Make Better Choices in Life and Work by Chip and his brother Dan Heath. Now, that the Heath brothers have yet to appear on Read to Lead as guests doesn't mean they've never been invited. This book was mentioned as a favorite by previous guests like Dan Miller, who we were just talking about, and Daniel Pink, among others. We've got Dan as one of the co-authors, two Dans recommending the book. I'm not sure what it is about the name Dan, but apparently Dan and authorship go hand in hand. Dan Miller says it's in his all-time top 10 among business books because of its critical look at how we make decisions. We're often quick to choose between A and B, Dan says. And he goes on to say, what they're saying is, what about C through Z? I often hear people say, boy, I'm in a job I hate, but if I quit, I won't make any money. Really? Are those the only two choices, Dan says? And though not on our list, another book by the Heath brothers called Made to Stick has also been cited a number of times by former guests. Cracking the top 10 on our list is a book by Robert Cialdini. It's called Influence: The Psychology of Persuasion. Now, this is a book the Journal of Marketing and Research calls among the most important books written in the last 10 years for marketers. It's no wonder, then, that former guests, influencers, and amazing marketers like Ray Edwards, Jia Zhang, and Lisa B. Marshall would mention it as having had an impact on their careers. Another guest mentioning the book was the Wharton School's G. Richard Schell, a guest way back in episode 8, who called it the best book about human interaction from a psychologist ever. Again, it's called Influence: The Psychology of Persuasion by Robert Cialdini. He has a brand new book out too, by the way, called Persuasion. I highly recommend that one as well. Number 9 on our list is from author Steven Pressfield. It's called The War of Art: Break Through the Blocks and Win the Inner Creative Battles. Now, Stephen is easily a favorite among my writing friends and colleagues. No surprise, then, that this book earns a mention from fellow creatives and previous Read to Lead guests like Sonny Brown, Taylor Pearson, and two-time guest John Acuff, among others. Former guest Ray Edwards says he's read it at least a dozen times. Ray says, anytime I feel stuck creatively or I begin to feel frustrated about getting bogged down by the details of my work, this book really wakes me up and brings me out of that space. It's The War of Art by Steven Pressfield. There are a handful of books on our top 12 list dealing with habits. It's no surprise then that in at number 8 is The Power of Habit: Why We Do What We Do in Life and Business by Charles Duhigg. The habit research alone cited in this book makes it well worth the read. And by the way, since the release of The Power of Habit, Charles sets out to explore the science of productivity in a book he published earlier this year called Smarter, Faster, Better: The Secrets of Being Productive in Life and Business. The Power of Habit, though, has been mentioned as a favorite read by former guests John Acuff, Michael Bungay Stanier, and Rachel Cruz, among others. About the book, guest Terry Lancaster says it's about how to effectively create habits personally, in organizations, and in products, creating products that are sticky and habits for people to come back to. It's a great book, Terry says, for a deep dive into the idea of habit formation. Again, it's The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. The 7th most recommended book by former Read to Lead guests is one called The One Thing: The Surprisingly Simple Truth Behind Extraordinary Results. That's by Gary Keller and Jay Papasan. This is one of the rare books I myself haven't gotten around to reading just yet. In a lot of circles, and this might be unfair to say, I'm not sure, but it seems the similarly themed book that comes in at number 3 on our list has overshadowed this one. More on that book in a moment. But for former guests Pat Flynn, Jeff Sanders, and Kimanzi Constable, The One Thing is a definite can't-miss book. In fact, I encourage you to check out Pat's interview with co-author Jay Papasan. It's a video interview that I've linked to in the show notes for this episode, which, by the way, can be found at readtoleadpodcast.com/top 12, the numbers 1 and 2. That's readtoleadpodcast.com/top12. About the book, former guest Jeff Sanders says, it's such an effective book for really knowing what matters in your life and identifying the few things that make the biggest difference and saying, today, what's my one thing going to be? Today, how am I going to cut out the distractions and the nonsense and just do the work that really makes a difference to me? I need that message in my head as often as possible to remind myself to stop doing dumb things, Jeff says. Great insight. Thanks, Jeff. In at number 6 on our list is a book that is considered by many a classic. It's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Powerful Lessons in Personal Change by Stephen R. Covey. What else can you say about this book? Well, this book gets a mention by former guest and personal branding expert Dan Schawbel, public speaking champion Ryan Avery, and former Disney executive Lee Cockrell, among others. With such a diverse group of successful names, including it at the top of their list, should it not be on yours? I think so. Ryan Avery says that he'll, quote, fight until we get it in schools. Everyone must read the book. I think it would make the world a better place. It's changed my life forever. Wow. If that's not an endorsement, I don't know what is. In at number 5 on our list is a book called The 4-Hour Workweek. Escape 9 to 5, live anywhere, and join the new rich. It's by Timothy Ferriss. And this is hands down one of my personal favorites from the last decade. In fact, it was this book from Tim and the book at number 12 on our list from Dan Miller, 48 Days to the Work You Love, that went hand in hand in helping open my eyes to thinking beyond just working that traditional job. Solopreneurs and former guests like Natalie Sisson, Dan Norris, and Chandler Bolt all mentioned the 4-Hour Workweek as one of their all-time favorites. Natalie says that Tim's book was a big foundational book for her and that, quote, it caused me to think about things in a different way. Tim set the scene for getting people to think outside of this standardized, traditional world that we live in. I couldn't agree more, Natalie. Number 4 is another classic, How to Win Friends and Influence People, the only book you need to lead you to success by Dale Carnegie. Now, upon the latest recommendation for this book from guest Pamela Wilson just a few weeks ago, who read it when she was just 12 years old, I decided to purchase a copy for my 13-year-old nephew, and he devoured it in just a couple of days. Now, in addition to Pamela's recent recommendation, influencers like Podcast Movement founder Jared Easley, sales and productivity expert Rory Vaden, leadership expert John Maxwell, and several others all couldn't list their all-time favorite books without mentioning this one. Former guest and funny guy Clay Clark cites it as one of his favorites and says, if you haven't read this book, you need to. Unless you're weird, you're going to have to influence friends and people. I think Clay's probably right. Number 3 on our list. I hinted at this one a moment ago when we talked about The One Thing from Gary Keller and Jay Papasan. This book, you might argue, is a similarly themed book to that one. It's really about focus. It's a book called Essentialism, The Disciplined Pursuit of Less by Greg McKeown. TV personality Steve Harvey was so impacted by this entry that he invited Greg to appear on his talk show. It's a fantastic interview, and I've embedded it on the show notes page for this episode. Again, that's readtoleadpodcast.com/top12, readtoleadpodcast.com/top12. Essentialism seems to have had an impact on so many, from former guest and Entrepreneur on Fire's Kate Erickson and blogger Michael Hyatt to Margie Worrell and the aforementioned Dan Miller. This is a must-read book. Greg and his book was featured previously on Read to Lead during episode 52. I encourage you to check that out as well. About essentialism, guest Margie Worrell says it's just a terrific book in terms of saying no and asking yourself, what are the few essential things you really need to focus on, and being able to discern where you add the most value. Kate Erickson admits the book changed her. She says, quote, it was so enlightening. Being a person who very much feels like I need to say yes to everything and feeling bad about saying no to people or opportunities, this book was so powerful. Now, in addition to my own chat with Greg back in episode 52, I also appreciated Michael Hyatt and Michelle Kashat's conversation with him as part of the This Is Your Life podcast. It's a video interview that I've also embedded into the show notes page for this episode. All right, 10 books down. 2 to go. What are the top 2 books recommended by former guests of the Read to Lead podcast? Well, in at number 2 is arguably another classic. This one from Napoleon Hill, and it's called Think and Grow Rich. From my friend and fellow podcaster and blogger Jeff Goins to Chris Hogan, Tim Sanders, Kelly Roach, and Brian Holmes, the impact of this book on the thinking of people I truly respect is unmatched. There is a newer version out that modernizes the language a bit. This book is several decades old, but I've chosen to link to a version of the original. Now, of this book, guest Kelly Roach says, quote, I've read it probably 15 times. I'll continue to read it for the rest of my life, and I really believe that it's from that book that I learned how important it is to never act entitled and how important it is to understand that absolutely anything is possible when you set your mind to it, do the work, and take action. Thanks, Kelly. And finally, that leaves us with the number 1 book, the most recommended, most mentioned book after 150 interviews with business book authors. That book is Good to Great: Why Some Companies Make the Leap and Others Don't by Jim Collins. This book was released back in 2001. I had the pleasure of first being exposed to it around 2003. And that's the year my love for reading was rekindled in a way, thanks to a former boss of mine who encouraged the staff to read together and led weekly meetings to talk about the books we were going through. Good to Great was one of the first business books I read, and it will always have a special place in my library. This one gets mentioned by former Read to Lead guests like Scott Fay, Rory Vaden, Beth Belo, Chris Hogan, Nancy Duarte, Rick Timon, Kathy Salet, and Dr. Henry Cloud, to name a few. Nancy Duarte, a best-selling author herself, says, quote, Jim Collins' work radically changed me. We go back to it almost every year. He said, if there's one thing you can be best in the world at, passionate about, and profitable at, do that one thing. That's when I narrowed what we at Duarte do to just presentations. Well, what about you? My hope is that this curated list from nearly 150 of today's top authors will inspire you to pick up a few reads that maybe you haven't gotten to yet. Have you read most of the books on this list already? Some of them, or maybe none of them? Any glaring omissions in your view, or any on the list that surprised you? I'd love to get your comments. Just go to readtoleadpodcast.com/top12. That's top, the number 1, and the number 2. readtoleadpodcast.com/top12. And check out any of these books in more detail and to leave your comments or your thoughts. As I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I'm giving away a copy of all 12 of these books to one lucky listener. And all you need do to enter is to take these 2 steps. First, share my blog post on social media and use the hashtag #ReadToLead. The blog post address you want to share is the one I've already mentioned a couple of times, readtoleadpodcast.com/top, and then the number 1 and the number 2 for top 12. readtoleadpodcast.com/top12. Share that blog post and use the hashtag #ReadToLead. Feel free to share it on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever you like to hang out the most. Then send me an email letting me know that you've done exactly that. You can send that email to jeff@readtoleadpodcast.com. That's jeff@readtoleadpodcast.com. Simply put contest in the subject field so I know right away what it's about. That's all you have to do. Share it on social media. Use the hashtag #ReadToLead and the blog post readtoleadpodcast.com/top12. And then email me to let me know you've done that. jeff@readtoleadpodcast.com with contest in the subject line. Simple enough? Great. The contest is open, by the way, through December 20th, 2016. Good luck to you. I hope you win all 12 of these books. If not, check out that blog post for links to each and every one. Well, that's going to do it for this week. I am so thankful for your time and attention. I look forward to seeing you next time for the Read to Lead podcast.
Thanks so much for listening to the Read to Lead podcast. As a subscriber, we challenge you to be more than just a passive listener. Become a vital member of the community. Visit us on the web at readtoleadpodcast.com. Until next time, remember, leaders read and readers lead.